Yeah, I've been waiting a long time for this too, I could say. Thinking back, it's actually around 2008, I think, when the Unicode version came out, that Dan Baronet started doing a lot of work creating what was then called salts and the user command system based on text files. And this is really the evolution of that. Here's Morten back to talk about text files again, because he thinks it's important. Why couldn't we just sit down in 2008 and design it right to begin with? Well, it's a long story. We had a lot to learn ourselves. The product needed new features. Parts of the infrastructure needed to become more robust. And the design is also made more interesting by the fact that we have people who've been using Workspaces and component files to store source code for many years. And on the other hand, we have the influx of the people who are now just saying, well, you know, give me shebang scripting and I'll be happy. And I feel it's really important that we try to come up with some designs that reduce any unnecessary fragmentation of the community. Most of the benefit of these tools is from being able to share tooling. And so we want to end up with a much smaller set of workflows and tools so that we can all share and become much more effective. Right, so what is Link? Very briefly, this is from the README on the GitHub repository. Link just enables the use of text files as the primary storage mechanism for APL source code. And we expect, especially for new applications, but hopefully also for a lot of old applications, it's going to replace component files and workspaces. And it's, you know, you wonder whether you can really do a presentation about this. It's really very simple. So there are user commands which allow you to declare that your source is in this folder. And what this will do is copy all the source files from that folder into your workspace, and you can start work. If you have some code that you just want to use, you can instead use link.import and bring that into a namespace. And once you've used one of these commands, you can just proceed to use APL normally, but without having to remember to type save at the end of your day. And I prepared documentation based around this. And in fact, about a month ago, I did an internal presentation at Dyalog because there's still quite a few people at Dyalog who are not really aware of Link and using it. And what happened after that was quite magical. John Daintree said that this has to be easier. And over the course of the next few weeks, together with Adam, I think doing most of the coding work, he came up with something which is really elegant and is forcing me now to rewrite all the documentation, which is a little bit annoying. But I'm going to risk departing from my slides here briefly to show you how this works. So here's my brand new Windows 11 machine with almost nothing on it. I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to call it blah. And then I'm going to right click on that. And I'm going to say, open with Dyalog. How is this possible? It worked a second ago. All right, I'm going to revert to the slides. This is just to show that this is real. This literally worked 2 seconds before I started this presentation. Anyway, what I did was I created a folder, I right-clicked on it. This code was written yesterday, the latest bits of it. If you have a beta of Dyalog APL 18.2, you're going to have to wait for the next beta to be able to do it yourself. Basically, open with Dyalog. I get an APL session where I have this line saying, well, I've linked the folder that you said open with Dyalog. I then edited 2 functions. I made one called dupe, which should maybe have been called trip because it makes 3 copies of X. I made a function called run, which launches the application. And as a result of that, what Link has done is it created in that folder one file for each of these functions with the extension APLF, APL function. So clicking on that with Dyalog APL recent installations, you get a preview and you can see in Windows Explorer what's happening. what's in the file, sorry. If you, instead of selecting the Open with Dyalog option, you click Run with Dyalog, it'll link the folder and then see if there's a function called run, which is monadic. If there is, it'll call it. And our application now can be run, either open for development or run just with these menu items. And I see there's a question. Yeah, please send the questions in. I'm perfectly happy to take questions as we go along. I'd rather respond to questions and maybe have to go a bit fast at the end and skip things. Yes, well, I'm glad you asked that question, Romley. Romley asked, will this work in Linux as well as Windows? And we don't have integration with the shell yet. I think that's something that we'll be looking at. The beautiful thing about Linux, of course, is there are lots of different desktops. But if you just want to do it from a shell, a command prompt, you just have to set this environment variable link dir for directory, and it works the same way in Linux. So this is showing I did that in Linux. It started the TTY version. I edited these two functions. I type off, and when I get out, I can see I have these two files created. And again, if I want to run the application, I just say link run. Yeah, the folder name here is a bit different. I've been testing with Windows Subsystem for Linux, which is really fantastic because I can immediately test the same things on Linux and Windows. The Windows file system is available as /mnt/c, my C drive, from my Linux system. And it works exactly as we saw for Windows. There's another question here from David. Does Link save a history of changes? This is one of the things that the old SALT system used to do. It had a very primitive source code management system where it would create an audit trail of old versions of a file with digits inserted as version numbers. Link does not do that. Link is very simple. It simply synchronizes what's in your workspace with what's in the files. If you want source code management functionality, you should use SVN or Git or one of the other really good tools that are available for that. And that's something that I think we quite firmly have no intention of trying to build into Link. All Link does is it makes the APL system able to use text files as source instead of the workspace. So we've just seen how we can quickly create a brand new application just by opening a folder with APL and typing. But a lot of people, of course, have an existing system already. So here's an example of my application. It's got 4 functions in it. There's a main function, and then there's 3 functions that happen to follow alphabetically. So I can do this cute partitioning of the source code. And we can see my application code on the left and the 3 utility functions in my statistics library listed on the right. So if I wanted to get that workspace converted to be used with Link, I could just load the workspace and say link.export and then identify the namespace, which in this case is just the root, which means export the entire workspace, and a folder. And we now have 4 functions converted or exported to files as expected. One of the things that Link, again, by design, does not deal with automatically is changes to variables. And that includes system variables. They're also variables. By default, Link will only work on functions. And if you want to work with variables, you have to explicitly identify which of the variables in your system should be thought of as source code. Often system variables are going to be in that category. So you can say, certainly quad.io and quad.ml, I need to have exported into the system, into the folder, so that I'm sure that when I load this, they have not the default values from the APL system, but the ones that I need for my application. And Link is using the experimental array format that was mentioned yesterday. So that's implemented as the mechanism for storing arrays within Link. If you think you don't know exactly which system variables you need to export, there's a flag And if you say -sysvars, it'll export all of the system variables that have namespace scope. And it'll do that recursively if you have a hierarchy of namespaces. You can see here that quad RL in a modern Dyalog APL system isn't the 16807 that we all remember from the early days. It's a more complicated structure that I don't have time to explain here. So effectively, link create replaces loading a workspace. It brings stuff into the workspace. The little arrows pointing in both directions tell us that the link is bidirectional. That currently requires .NET, but that may be something we can think about. So we now have our 4 functions back. We can run our function. It computes the statistics that we were expecting. Now, if we decide that we want the folder structure to mirror, or we want to do, we have some structure in our application that because we were using a flat workspace, we didn't actually, it wasn't convenient to create that structure in the workspace. Perhaps the application predates namespaces. But now that we're going to export it to files, it's a good time to think about whether we should, in fact, create a directory structure. So if we decide that we'd like to have the application code in one folder and then the statistics library, which is perhaps shared with our other applications and maintained by other people in a different folder, we can easily do that with Link as well. One thing you could do is just use your file manager and restructure the directory. So after the original export with these 4 files, create some folders out there, copy the files around using manually or whatever tools you have at your disposal. And then when you bring them back into the workspace again, a namespace structure will be created corresponding to that. Or you could do the dividing up of the application explicitly from APL. You could say, make these 2 folders, export the function main into the my app folder, and then maybe you have a list of the functions in each module in your application. You can construct function calls like this to export individual functions to, maybe several folders. In this case, we only have 1. And that creates the same structure that we saw on the previous slide where we'd done it manually. Now, when you bring this code back into the workspace, so if we just repeat again, link create and the name of the folder, now because there are two directories out there, we have 2 namespaces in the workspace. And we have to call the main function by saying myapp.main. And of course, it fails because the mean function isn't in that namespace. Right, now, there is an option called flatten, which is intended for use with old code that needs to be flat, but where you'd like to divide it up into folders to make them, to organize your maintenance. When you do a link create, you can set the flatten option, and that will then not create namespaces, but bring everything into a flat workspace. So we could have done this here, then we wouldn't have had to make the following code change. But I think we'd like to make the code change because, we want to take the opportunity while we're converting the code to Link to create some structure in our application. So we need to add a bit of code here to make references to the other namespace and refactor the code a little bit. We don't have any automated tools for doing that. Maybe that's an idea we should think about. Okay, I see all the open questions were answered by Adam. Yes, I mean, yeah, again, so there's a question about preserving function timestamp and author. Again, we see that as something that is in the domain of the source code management system. There may be a case for when you load code from a source code management system to get hold of whatever information that Git or SVN have about a file and replicate that inside the workspace so that it's easily accessible to somebody who's working in the workspace. They don't have to go out to Git and do blame and so on. Right, now what about workspaces? Say you start work, you bring in your application, you create some interesting data that you're going to do an analysis of, and then somebody reminds you that there's this wonderful video you should go off and watch, and so you decide to pause your work and you save it as a workspace and type off and close your computer and come back later. This is something that's new in Link 3.0, which is really a huge step forward in terms of usability. In the old system, if you did this, you would be able to save the workspace, but then you'd be in a kind of indeterminate state when you came back. Version 18.2 with Link 3.0 solved this problem by recording information about the fact that there were links in a saved workspace. A quick check is run to see whether there are any differences between what's in the workspace and what's on file. And if, as in this case, we can see that nothing has changed inside or outside, everything matches, you just get the message, well, the link has been restored and you can continue work. If, on the other hand, you did that, you went off to your distraction, and then while the APL system was closed down, somebody did a git pull, or they opened one of the source files with Notepad in this case, made a change and saved it, then when you come back and load the workspace, you get a warning that says a link resync is required because there is a difference now that's been detected between what's in the workspace and what's out there. And in this case, the user then, before doing a link resync, makes matters worse by copying a function in using paren copy, which is something that Link doesn't immediately detect. It only has hooks in the editor. So now we have a function in the workspace that isn't on file, and one of the files has been changed. And it's the job of link resync to detect this and tell you that updates are required. You have a quick look at what link resync recommends, and if you like that, you can say proceed, and then the files are copied in the necessary directions, and you can continue work. If you don't like that, you're going to have to take some manual steps to sort the situation out. But most of the time, this is going to work. So a lot of people, when they start with Link, they export the code into files, but then still most comfortable using a function to actually start things. So in this case, we can see there's a workspace, run.dws. I don't know if you all know that in recent versions of Dyalog APL, if you have a workspace, you can click on it, and then you get a preview workspace explorer. So we can see that there's a function in here called run, and click on that. And without starting an APL system, we can see from Explorer that there is this function inside the workspace. So there's a function here which is called by QuadLX, which creates a link to my app and imports stats because there's no intention of changing it. And then that's one way of starting the workspace. So saved workspaces are not dead. I mean, they're going to be supported for pausing work and doing crash analysis and so on. But we're really trying to get away from the use of workspaces as permanent storage for source code. You should use Link to update the text files, and then either have your own version control system by zipping up or copying, taking backups of those text files, or using, we would recommend SVN, Git, or a similar system to manage the source code. Now, if you want to try and launch your application without workspaces, so a pure text-based system, you have a few options. You can just add a function called run to the folder, and then when you use run with Dyalog, or you launch Dyalog with the link run environment variable set or set on the command line, then the system will search for a function called run and run it. in the case where we had segmented the workspace up into 2 folders, things are a little bit more complicated because if we would most naturally start by running the application code by having a run function in the my app folder and then launching that. And that means that the application is then responsible for going out to import any libraries that it needs. So we can see the run function here doesn't just call main. It fortunately receives the directory that it resides in as the argument. So the startup code provides the application with information about where the source code is. And in this case, because we designed the directory structure, we can infer that if we go up a level, then there's a stats folder there that we can pick things up from. But of course, this really leads very quickly into the discussion about package management and loading utilities that Brian is going to be talking about later today. So this is essentially your own simple package manager, 1 line of code. But of course, as things get more complicated, you're going to want a system to help you with that. So we've seen this slide already. This is one of the slides from right at the beginning under Linux, or I presume AIX. I haven't actually tested that myself. I don't have an AIX system on my desktop, but this should work on all supported platforms. The file system watcher isn't available on AIX because we have no .NET there. So I used to start my presentations by scaring everybody away, going up onto GitHub and creating a repository. And that caused a lot of eyes to glaze over. I'm not going to do that, but I am going to say that once you get used to using Git and GitHub together with this, you never want to go back. So those who have used Git can see that now I've got now in addition, this is a checkout of a Git repository. You can tell because it's got a license and a README file. And so again, I can go into my app. I can run this with Dyalog the same way I would before, and I then have the benefit that because it's a GitHub repository, if I were to edit a function, for example, while I'm in there, then I typically have VS Code open on a second monitor. I don't typically use VS Code for typing very much, but I do use it for searching and for keeping an eye on my diffs. So as I work during the day, I have this very, very nice user interface where I can see exactly which functions changed. I can see which lines of code changed. It's really an excellent system. I can go back and look at the old commits. You can see a list of them in the panel on the left and see everything that's happened in the last, well, forever. Right, so it's a good time to take a question. I see Yves asks, what's the difference between refresh and resync? So in link 2.0, there was a function and a user command called refresh. I can't actually remember if it's still there. It did a very brutal relinking, so it would read everything back in again. Resync is very careful. It goes out and looks at timestamps and compares the contents of files and tells you what has changed. And then it doesn't resync unless you add the -proceed after having read the intentions of the resync function. Right. So how do you want to learn about this if you think this is starting to look promising? The user commands, of course, have help delivered by the user command system in the same way that all other user commands have. So we see at the top here, link -? gives us a list of all the link user commands. And 2/3 of the way down, I do link create -? And that gives me the abbreviated help for link create. So I can see all the different options. We can see sysvars and flatten. I don't have time to go through all of those, but the interesting thing here is that the last line of output is a link to the online help. So if you want to get into the help system, you would click on that, and that takes you into the online help system, which is stored as part of the GitHub repository. And here we can see, so we're using Markdown for this, and something called Mike, if I remember correctly, McDocs, which is a really nice system for authoring documentation. So I can't scroll here. This is a screenshot, but you can see on the right-hand side here, the common options and the advanced options, and they're all documented here. If you go to the root of the documentation, you can see on the left-hand side the various chapters. So we've tried to pull together all the documentation also for, you can see, migrating from Salt, migrating from Link version 2, for those people who have been following us on this journey so far. Highlights of Link 3, I think we've seen most of them. Most of the benefit is, or it works really well with 18.2. It does also work with 18.0, but there are a few of the things like the resync and link dir and link run, I think are going to require 18.2. It's starting to become quite widely used. It handles resync, and it supports names that differ only in case. So this isn't something I would recommend that you do, but of course a lot of old systems have little foo and uppercase foo, and of course in a case insensitive file system, this is a problem. And there's a case coding strategy where after the name of the function or variable operator, whatever it is, we add some numerals which encode the casing and make the file names different. Too many improvements to list here. Fortunately, because this is on Git and we're using the Git issue system, you can actually go to the GitHub repository and you can see all the issues that have been raised and closed and their current status. You see, we still have a few, mostly documentation issues open. And a bug that I found while preparing the demo, as always, user meetings are great for finding stuff. You can get all sorts of statistics about contributions to the system. You see we have quite a few authors here, mostly people working for Dyalog, but it's really good to see contributions, at least bug reports, and in some cases actual fixes. I have a lot more pluses than minuses. I think that's mostly because I wrote the documentation and that was all new. So there's a good number of additional lines. And with about 1 minute to go, I think, what are we planning for the next release? Well, it won't necessarily be with 19.0. We're maintaining this independently of Dyalog releases, so you can follow what we're doing there. We'll be creating a milestone, adding features to it. You can recommend, you can ask for features to be added. Most important, I think, I hope we'll be able to finish the crawler. It should have been in 3.0. It's a thing that will wake up every now and again and do a resync and tell you if things have somehow got out of sync from where they were. And maybe after Stefan's presentation yesterday, we'll have to think again about a file system watcher that doesn't require .NET. But certainly to get to where we are now, the use of .NET to give us a leg up was really valuable. Again, the milestone is actually already there, so you can go and take a look at what's already on the list for 3.1. And your next steps should be, if I will stop talking, listen to, I think Josh is on next. He's going to be talking about development operations, not directly related to Link, but closely related. And Brian's going to be talking about a package manager, which is also in the same kind of area.